The entire contents of this podcast and website are based upon the opinions of Tammy Garcia and her guests, unless otherwise noted. The information on this podcast is not intended to replace a one-on-one relationship with a qualified healthcare professional and is not intended as medical advice. It is intended as a sharing of knowledge and information from the research and experience of Tammy Garcia and her guests. This is the Naturally Inspired Podcast, coming to you from our 1890 homestead in Johnstown, Colorado. I'm Tammy, and I want to thank you for joining us. Let's get started and help people feel good so they can do what they love for longer. Today on the Naturally Inspired Podcast, we have Senator Scott Jensen joining us from Minnesota. Senator Jensen is also a practicing family physician. He was awarded Minnesota's Family Physician of the Year in 2016. Dr. Jensen has recently come under fire for what he's been saying regarding the virus. He was investigated in July by the Board of Medical Practice. That investigation was dropped, and he is now being investigated again for spreading information that, quote, is a danger to public health. Dr. Jensen is a qualified physician asking questions about political moves in relation to health, medicine, and patient care when it comes to handling the virus specifically. This was a great conversation, packed with information about testing, the power of us asking questions, and what we can do to stand up to protect our freedoms, and also improve relationships when it comes to our medical care. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did with Senator Scott Jensen. Thank you, Senator Jensen, for being a guest on the Naturally Inspired Podcast today. You are a hot topic these days. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to the Naturally Inspired Podcast. It's an honor to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And it's a pleasure to do this because what you're doing is you're trying to broaden the engagement on the part of all citizens. And that's really what we need. These are frightening times.
Yes. And you were a voice of reason to me as a mom when this first started happening. I thankfully caught wind of your videos, early part of July. So it was a little bit a ways in. But you had such a voice of reason about what was going on. And you were really trying to get across to people, hey, there's stuff we can do here. When everybody was not focusing on that. They were not focusing and being so interested in health myself. And, that's what we primarily talk about here on Naturally Inspired Podcast, how we can be healthy, feel good for longer. What kind of steps do we take in our life to maintain health? And that health takes maintenance, right?
That's exactly right. I think that sometimes it's sort of like some students at college, they won't sit down to study unless they've got a big chunk of time available, and then they'll sit down and do it all then. And sometimes people take that same approach towards their health. I'll make a big decision to turn my health around, but I've got to get to the right place and point in time. So next month on the 15th, that will be the time I start. And what the response really should be is, I'm going to start right now. If I'm smoking, I'm going to try to reduce the amount of cigarettes I'm smoking by half. And when I do smoke, I'm going to try to enjoy it more, but do less. So that ultimately maybe I can keep winnowing down what number of cigarettes I'm using. And I'm going to lose 5 pounds in the next 2 weeks. And I'm going to start taking some zinc. And I have muscle cramps, so I'm going to add magnesium. And I'm going to eat green vegetables every other day, even if I don't like them. We've got to do it now. This idea of American procrastination is killing our country.
Yes, but you're blowing my mind right now because you're a medical doctor, an allopathic medical doctor. And this is when I was actually listening to your video when I was running on my treadmill. And I was like, I couldn't believe that you were saying this. You were saying that we can be proactive with our health. And just the fact that you're mentioning these things right now is so different. Do you realize how different your methods are?
Well, but I've had 35 years in the trenches and I've been able to see it. I have patients that weigh 300 pounds and their ideal weight might be 220.
Right.
But if I can get them to lose not 30 pounds or 50 pounds, if I can get them to lose 10 pounds, I can typically demonstrate to them that their glucose level went down, their LDL cholesterol fraction went down, and their energy level went up. They feel better, their blood pressure's better, and I can show them that. I said, we don't have to do everything in a month, but if we just start making incremental changes, and that's the way we're wired as humans.
Yeah.
When we make a little progress, it's better and easier for us to make a little more progress. When my wife and I were raising our kids, we made them do a half hour of study every morning in the summer.
Mhm.
Not because we were taskmasters, though we may have been,
Yeah.
but it was because we wanted our kids to, at least in one subject area, develop an area where they felt like they were really good at it, where they were
Right.
experts at it.
Right.
So we had 7-year-old children that could do the multiplication tables pretty darn well. They might not have been super at this, or this, but if they get a taste of doing well, a taste of achieving, a taste of excelling,
Hmm.
that'll stimulate their appetite to want to do more. And I
Yes.
really think that's the way humans are wired. And it's the same way in terms of taking control of our own health. One of the biggest travesties that's gone on in the last 80 years in, if you will, Western medicine is if you go back to 1940 when we started to have availability of antibiotics, the world pivoted. All of a sudden, physicians became this incredible commodity. We became smarter in the space of a year. We became talented beyond imagination in the space of a decade. Christian Bernard did a heart transplant, and all of a sudden, there was nothing we couldn't do. What did that mean? That meant that people had to genuflect in front of physicians, never argue with them, and say,
Right.
"Thank you, doctor, for being willing to see me." And that's all mixed up because, quite frankly, as we've watched healthcare unfold in the last 2 decades, we're seeing the cost of when
Right.
patients don't champion their own healthcare. It's physicians pummeling, bullying, prodding, taking charge of patients' care, and getting frustrated with patients for not getting it done. I've seen patients come to me because they've been kicked out of medical practices because they weren't doing well enough or they weren't willing to follow the doctor's recommendations, which is astonishing to me. Marcus Welby has gone out the window. Doctors are now the kingpin. We're George Patton walking around commanding the troops what they'll do, when they'll do, and how they'll do it. And you don't get results then.
Right.
You don't.
Right.
We need to have patients be their own best champion. We
Right.
need to remind patients that they're capable of it, that they don't have to be frightened, because when we frighten them, we paralyze them. And when we paralyze them, they are not as healthy as they could be.
Right. Oh, I couldn't agree more. This should be a relationship, right? It's a
Absolutely.
relationship that you have with your healthcare practitioner, not a dictatorship.
Now, I did not plant that plug, but I actually wrote a book, and I don't mean to, if you will, advertise my book. But
No,
four
please
years
do.
ago, I wrote a book, and the title of it is Relationship Matters. And it talks about the fracturing of the relationship between patients and doctors. And
Wow.
that relationship has been fractured by multiple sources. Certainly, insurance companies have done it,
Yes.
but
Yes.
physicians have done it. Patients have done it. I've
Mhm.
actually told patients that come to see me for the first time, I've told them, if you're interested in dumping your healthcare concerns on my lap and, so to speak, emptying your bucket, please find someone else. I'm
Right.
not interested.
Right.
If you want me to be a
Wow.
resource, I'll be glad to help. I tell my patients all the time, if there's a professional golfer in the room and there's a caddy in the room, it's the patient that is Tiger Woods. I am the caddy. I carry
Right.
the clubs. I advise them that there's a headwind, that there's a sand trap on the right and water on the left. But in the end, I hand the 7-iron to my patient. They have to strike the ball and put it on the green. I can't do that for them.
What a great analogy. What a great analogy. And that's exactly what we need to shift at. And I want to talk about that later about shifting this paradigm because that's where my passion lies. I want to see some change in our structure of healthcare in this country. But first, I want to get into PCR testing, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
The general public, in my opinion, does not have a good understanding of what a COVID test is. Many people view it as like a pregnancy test. You're either positive or negative. Can you explain that?
Yes, I can. And that's a great question. And it's extremely pertinent. Let's just take a little styrofoam ball, maybe the size of a baseball. You have a
Okay.
styrofoam ball. Then you take some golf tees and you stick those golf tees all around, different colored golf tees, but you stick them into the styrofoam all around this ball. Now we have what we consider our metaphor for a COVID-19 virus. The inside styrofoam, the white styrofoam, that's where you're going to have your RNA material.
Okay.
And these T's that are sticking out, these are sort of the corona means crown. These are the little pointy antigens or receptors sticking outside of the virus.
Okay.
We can do testing for the COVID-19 virus by going after one or the other. If we're going to go after the RNA material, the white styrofoam ball,
Hmm.
which is sort of wrapped upon itself, then we're going to do a PCR test, which stands for polymerase chain reaction. And what that does is we take not the whole RNA virus, which is what COVID-19 is. We take just a snippet, just a strand, just a piece.
Hmm.
We look for that. We look for that in saliva or nasal secretions. But in order for us to turn a test positive, we have to amplify it. So if we could find a piece that matches, then this PCR test is an amplification. And so we might have to cycle this test once, twice, 10 times, 30 times, or 40 times.
Right.
If we, first time we cycle it, it turns positive. That tells us that we've got a lot of this COVID-19 RNA showing up right away.
Okay.
But if we have to cycle it 5 times, each time we do it, it doubles. So if we start out with 2 strands and we go to 4, 8, 16, 32, within 30 cycles, we're over 1 billion. Within 40 cycles, we're over 1 trillion. When we do PCR testing, and PCR testing actually was not originally created to diagnose viral diseases, it was actually created in regards to a lot of the research with HIV in the
Right.
1980s, where what we wanted to do is we wanted to produce enough DNA material so we could study it. And
Right.
one of the best ways to create this material was to use this polymerase chain reaction, PCR.
Hmm.
But we found that we could use and tweak this process to diagnose things. And so we've done that. But we've probably at times gone beyond the limits of what we can trust. And so we get things like false positives. So let's go back to cycling. So if we have to cycle something 1 billion times in order to find enough of it to turn the test positive, we might want to raise an eyebrow. But that's
Right.
sort of the standard. When we use PCR testing to check for viruses, we'll cycle 30 times, maybe 33 times. But if you cycle not 33 times, but instead 37 or 40 times,
40. Yeah.
you might think, well, that's not that much more. It is a lot more because you're already in the billions. So now all of a sudden, you're jacked up into the trillions. And
Right.
what we're finding is that if we had used a normal cycle threshold cutoff at 33, in a lot of these reported data chunks, we would have found that 80 to 85% of the people that were reported as having a positive PCR test would have indeed had a negative test. But
Right.
instead, the FDA allowed the manufacturers of these tests to go ahead and go to 40 cycles or to 37. This is a game changer. And
Hmm.
that's why there are epidemiologists and virologists and scientists around the nation asking, well, why in the world did you use a threshold of 40 cycles? We don't do that. And so I think that to sort of distill it back down, what we know is that if we can get a positive test in those first few cycles, we probably have a pretty high viral load.
Right.
That could be a person
Right.
that would have, if you will, great potential to spread the disease. But if we're not getting a positive test until we're at 30, 33 cycles, we may well have a situation where even though we've got a positive test, we really don't have any significant amount of infectious virus. Some studies have indicated that the best cutoff for who can transmit and who wouldn't would be about 24 cycles. So when we go to 33, we know that we're capturing some people that may well not be able to transmit. But when we go from 33 to 40, it looks like we're doing everything we can to, if you will, find positive PCR tests.
Right. And
now, having said that, if I could just add one other snippet.
Yeah.
There's another way to test for active disease, and that's called the antigen test. And instead of using a PCR test to go and look at that white styrofoam ball, the antigen test are looking at these specific golf tees that are sticking into the styrofoam ball, those pointy, crown-like receptor antigens. And that's a different test. And that has its own set of problems, but it has some improvements over the PCR. And then the last test that we talk about is generally not considered an acute disease now kind of test. It's more of a look in the rearview mirror. And yes, you've had COVID-19, you now have antibodies. And that's a serology blood test.
Okay. So is this why we're seeing so many false positives? Like I read an article about, 77 NFL players testing positive and then they walk it back. Are they changing the threshold of the number to get a negative or a positive, in your opinion, in different states? Like, does every state have their different threshold?
I think your question's a very good one. And I don't want to represent myself beyond what I am. I think I have a pretty solid understanding of this, but my understanding is that the cycle threshold is generally set by the manufacturer in concert with FDA authorization.
So everybody has the same threshold?
No.
No.
A manufacturer has a threshold. And so if the state of Colorado and the state of Minnesota both buy the same tests from the same manufacturers, then they would be utilizing the same cycle threshold. But it may be that Colorado bought from a different manufacturer than Minnesota. It may be that one is at 37 and others at 40. But
so there's multiple producers of the test.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think one of the questions that we've asked as physicians is, why aren't you telling us what cycle threshold number you got to or you're getting to give us a positive test? Because we're not getting that data. We're getting a binary choice, like you said before about a pregnancy test. It's positive or it's negative. And that's an oversimplification. And so if 77 football players all have a positive test and they say, gee whiz, you haven't had any symptoms at all. We've been careful as you could possibly be. And they go and get a different test the next day with a different set of false positives, false negatives, sensitivity, specificity, and cycle threshold, and they all come back negative. Now you've got to ask yourself, okay, what happened on day one?
Right. Do we all carry, we all have tons of viruses inside us, right?
Tons of antibodies. In terms of viruses, we may well have virus on us in our nasal pharynx and things like that aren't able to cause disease. But in terms of quantifying it into tons of virus on us each and every day, I'd say we all have a fair amount of fungus, we have a fair amount of bacteria, and we have some viruses. But I think that on the whole, we'd have to say that the viruses we do harbor are non-pathogenic.
Right. So we can test positive for things without having any symptoms.
Absolutely. We have coronaviruses that we've all already engaged with, probably 4 or 5, maybe even 6, oftentimes causing cold-like symptoms. And we might well find antibodies to that for sure in our systems. And we might even find people that are having cold symptoms, and they could have one of those coronaviruses. But those coronaviruses should not turn these PCR tests positive, though we're concerned about that.
Right. Why are you concerned about that?
Well, because our data has been so mushy and we haven't had the kind of reliability and reproducibility that we normally look for. We expect our testing to be rock solid. And quite frankly, since the beginning of this COVID-19 pandemic, we've had one stumble or bumble after another, starting with the CDC having their batches of tests being contaminated and then retooling and trying again and sort of turning their back on other possible sources of good solid tests. We could have gone to other first world countries that had already moved past some of the steps that the CDC was sort of having to recreate. So we haven't done very well.
Right. And that leads me to my next question, because in your videos, when I watch your videos, you're always asking questions and you're encouraging people to ask questions. I don't know how many times you've said that. We need to ask the right questions. We need to ask questions. But yet, every time somebody like yourself or other doctors ask questions about things, they're reprimanded.
It's been a challenge. I was raised in a home that I should be skeptical. I was raised in the middle of the civil rights mid 60s movement, and then we slid from there into Vietnam, and certainly the incredible tragedies of students at Kent State being killed. So, and my dad was a lawyer, and then he was a politician, and he was a judge, and so we were always taught to question. And I remember with the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, we had a little less than 20% positives, but you really had, if you will, at some level, you had a petri dish.
Right, cruises are like that.
This was a wonderful, unintended experiment.
Yeah.
And so what we should have been doing is telling the world that we were going to pay each one of these cruise passengers and staff, we're going to pay them $1,000 to let us draw their blood every 2 weeks for the next year. And we should have been doing some nasopharyngeal testing and some saliva testing, and we should have been doing blood testing, looking for IgM antibodies and IgG antibodies and IgA antibodies. And we should have said, we're going to milk this situation, albeit unintended. We're going to milk it for as much data as we can get. Right. Same thing with the Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier. When you've got 5,000 soldiers living together and sleeping in triple bunks, and you find out that you've got a little less than 1,000 of them with disease, we've got to ask the question, why didn't the other 4,000 get that? Right. Is it because they have an intrinsic disease resistance, like many of us do to leprosy? I always tell people, if you go back to the days of Jesus and you ask, why wasn't leprosy, it's talked about quite a bit. Why wasn't
everybody dead?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's because 90% of the population couldn't get it if they put it on their Cheerios in the morning, because we have an intrinsic disease resistance. So that's one way that we're resistant to COVID-19. But then there's another group that have cellular immunity. And cellular immunity is the kind of thing that protects us against diseases oftentimes like tuberculosis. And then certainly we have this other kind of immunity called humoral immunity or antibody-mediated immunity. But if we're testing these 5,000 soldiers on the Theodore Roosevelt, and we have 1,000 positives and 4,000 negatives, we need to go after those 4,000 and say, can you please help us? We can learn from your body, from your antibodies, from your immune system. We should have checked them for T-cell immunity. We should have checked them for antibody immunity. We should have checked them for antigen testing for the COVID-19 on an acute basis, as well as the PCR. We should have milked that situation for as much good data as we could, and we should have made it transparent. So epidemiologists and scientists around the world could cogitate on this and say, how do we figure this out?
Right. Isn't that the very basis of science, especially in the medical field, right? Is to propose an idea and then everybody works to kind of shoot it down to see if they can disprove it.
At the basic level, science is 3 steps, and everybody should know this because we live and breathe by science. Science is number 1, observation. Number 2, measurement. Number 3, hypothesize. That's what we do. And when we have a hypothesis, then we have to create an experiment to confirm or deny the hypothesis. Right. That's what we did when we saw the apple fall from the tree. We watched it fall from the tree. It didn't fall up. It fell down.
Right.
And then we measured. Did that apple fall at the same rate as that apple? Did that apple do something different? And then we hypothesize. And that's how we came up with gravity.
Right.
This is science. Science is not something that gets corrupted or bastardized because it's convenient for someone's narrative. So all of a sudden, 20 years worth of virology and physics regarding masks and things like this are thrown out the window because we desperately want to do something. We don't want to kill grandma. So we come out and we say, oh, my stars, masks are the deal.
Right.
Forget that we were being taught this about N95 masks or this about surgical masks or this about cotton masks. Don't talk to people that work with these kinds of particulate matter every day. Don't talk to OSHA people.
Right.
Just let politicians and bureaucrats and academics pontificate and tell you it's so. Well, I'm
Right.
sorry. That doesn't make it so. Right now, our whole physics and world of masks really is up in the air. I get it. We're all trying to do whatever we can.
Mhm.
But this issue is not resolved. Over the next 5 years, there will be good, solid research that will be based on randomized controlled trials, double blinded studies, peer
Mhm.
review across the world. You cannot necessarily just trust United States studies because it
Right.
might be that we've got some confounding variables. Maybe who's paying for the study, maybe
Yes.
who's reaping profits from the study.
Yep.
So we need to have Germany and France and England and Australia and China and countries all over the world. They need to do the studies too. And then we
Right.
need to correlate our data. And we say, you know what? This is science.
Right. Do you feel like there is a suppression, and that because doctors are being censored for the most part? Many doctors have been silenced on social media. They've gone after their character. They've come under scrutiny, such as yourself. You have, have a wonderful practice. You've been practicing for many decades and never had a problem. And now, July 5th, I think it was, you posted the video where your license was under review.
And then 4 days ago, I posted another such video because once again, my license is under review.
But it was
Yeah.
already cleared from July 5th, right? You
Yeah.
got cleared, and now you've got another anonymous,
Yeah.
which is
Well,
key.
yeah, it's anonymous to me. The person cannot be, the identity won't be shown to me, but clearly the Board of Medical Practice knows who this person is.
Mm.
It started really in March, Tammy. I think I was attacked on Twitter because someone thought that some of my comments were minimizing the impact of COVID 19 because they were in the context of how influenza also behaved. Mind you, that Fauci and Osterholm and Redfield and these people are making the same comparisons. But when I
Yeah,
did it, they cried foul. And the fact of the matter is, both COVID 19 and influenza viruses are single stranded RNA viruses.
right.
Well, then in April, I was attacked by politicians. And then in May, it was the mainstream media. All of a sudden, I was responsible because I had done videos, and some of those videos had pieces of the videos sliced and diced and put into someone else's narrative.
Right,
So if all of a
context.
sudden someone who was considered a deep website or whatever that's called, I was responsible. So I have been asked, well, why didn't you stop them? I don't know how you stop someone from taking something on social media and using it to their own purposes. If
You
someone knows how
can't.
to do that, let me
Yeah.
know. So
Mhm.
then in June, I find out that the Board of Medical Practices, is questioning and interrogating and investigating me. So then in July, I finally find out, okay, that's been let go. Then in August, I get another one. So as far as I'm concerned, since this COVID-19 thing happened, and it all started because I got a communication from the Minnesota Department of Health that seemed to be coaching me to be more willing to use COVID 19 as a diagnosis on a death certificate
That's
as the definitive cause of death. And I'd never received that coaching before for any other disease entity.
Mhm.
And so I just basically asked the question, why are you doing this?
Yeah. Who did you ask that question to?
Well, it came up with an interview with Chris Berg on a Fargo Moorhead news program on a Tuesday night. I think it was April 7th. And he very alertly said, hold it, Dr. Jensen, are you telling me that you're getting advice on how to complete death certificates? And I said, well, yeah, this is what it amounted to. And so then we talked about the Department of Health and how they linked a CDC document to the Department of Health's communication. And in that document, it basically said you don't need to have a positive COVID-19 test in order to
Presumptive
diagnose COVID-19.
presumptive symptoms can be.
Presumptive, assumed, probable, within reason, suspected. All of a sudden, it was getting squishy. And I've
Yeah,
always sort of thought we should be using phrases like precise and specific,
sure, especially
yeah,
in terms of science.
especially in terms of death certificates.
Yeah, for sure. Um, what about peer reviews when it comes to this type of thing? Where are we at with that? Because if you're not able to share your findings at your like, because you have a practice, you are seeing COVID patients, are you not?
Yes.
Yeah. So where are you able to share and get peer reviews on this? Because this is a new virus. This is new, all new. You're all learning here. This would be, to me, where you would all be kind of, debriefing together to see how your results are. Every time someone brings out their results with some therapeutics or whatnot, it's very, it's suppressed. So how are you getting peer review? How are you debriefing?
That's a great question. Peer review has unfortunately come to be more and more a process of examination of data and outcomes and experiments and hypotheses in the, if you will, medical world of journals. So we look for a lot of peer review to take place in Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA and the American Academy of Family Practice Journal. In the past, we had a more robust system of peer review with grand rounds where doctors would gather, Friday morning conferences where we'd have general topics discussed by a peer, and we would go over what's the latest and greatest as to how should we address thyroid nodules, things like that. We would have Tuesday morning tumor conferences, and we would go over a patient with prostate cancer and say, what are this person's best options? What
Right.
is the likelihood that they'll have an expanded lifespan from these options?
Hmm.
But we also had this kind of peer review that you're making reference to, where we would talk one to another. We would talk. We wouldn't get angry. We wouldn't go out for vengeance. We wouldn't hold someone in contempt because we had differing viewpoints. We would talk. We'd talk on the phone. We'd have curbside consults with specialists. That kind of peer review was important also. It may not have been as structured and formal as grand rounds were. It may not be as demanding as writing articles and getting them submitted to the New England Journal of Medicine and approved. But all of those, if you will, layers of peer review were important
Yeah.
for us to learn. And we've sort of had a couple of them pushed aside. And I'm very concerned about the medical profession because we've got a schism where it seems like it, and I hate to say it this way, but it almost feels like in the trenches, physicians are being almost minimized in terms of their impact on this process of how do we treat COVID 19. And
Right.
we're supposed to sort of bow down to the, if you will, researchers and academicians and the people who we oftentimes refer to as residing in ivory towers.
Right.
Well, they're not in the trenches with
No.
Maggie. I'm the
That's
one
right.
who's hearing Maggie cry for her life as
Right.
she's on her fourth day of symptoms.
Right.
Certainly isn't bad enough where she has to go to the hospital,
Right.
but she's aware of the fact that she's not getting better as quickly as a lot of the people she had talked with. And she
Right.
doesn't want to simply wait for her body to get over it or to get worse and land in the hospital and
Right.
possibly be a candidate for a ventilator. She wants to do what she can do now.
Right.
And so that's where, in my perspective, I'm saying, well, let's do vitamin C and vitamin D. Let's look at zinc and magnesium. But maybe we should be looking, because you're having some wheezing in your lungs, even though it's minimal, let's think about budesonide or some other
Right.
form of steroid inhaler or nebulizer. And
Right.
then we always get to the big question, what about hydroxychloroquine?
Right.
Then they'll ask about remdesivir. And people need to know remdesivir is not available to me for treatment of my outpatient practice.
Wow.
Remdesivir is hospital restricted, but hydroxychloroquine is now available. And I think even several national organizations have put out notifications to people that yes, physicians can use hydroxychloroquine, but
Let's
they
talk.
need to meet with the patient and we need to have serious discussions and we need to be responsible for what we're doing. We can't throw mud on the wall and say, well, we're going to do this because this is what the patient ordered. We
Right.
still need to
Right.
go through the scientific process.
Oh my goodness. I'll tell you personally, when I kind of lost faith in my physician was when I started seeing advertisements for drugs and different modalities in his waiting room, and then I would go back, and wouldn't you know, I would get offered that particular procedure or drug. I mean, that's where the lines are really getting blurred. And I understand there's a lot of information about the different therapeutics available. And when people are in fear, they're going to go to their doctor and ask for that particular thing because that's what they've heard that works, and they're acting out of fear. But with a proper relationship with your physician, right, you can make the right decision. But are you right now able to treat your patients the way you want to?
I'd say 90%. I mean, there's no question I'm being very careful. I do feel like I have a target on my back,
Yeah.
so I need to be very careful. I think that there are some patients that I would love to be able to send over to the hospital or to a specialist and say, I don't think this is a good candidate for hydroxychloroquine, but I'd like to do
Mm.
something for them. And I've started this and this. Do you think that this person might be a candidate for remdesivir?
Mm.
Now, remdesivir has had mixed results, to be sure, and it's important to note that the FDA has never approved remdesivir for any medical indication as of yet. It's received an emergency use authorization. But I would like to be able to do that kind of referral, but I don't see that available to me right now. But in terms of being able to use budesonide or dexamethasone or other steroid nebulizers or inhalers, or even hydroxychloroquine, zinc,
Mhm.
magnesium, things like that, I feel like we're in a better place than we were a month and a half ago.
Is that when you were able to, prescribe the HCQ as about a month and a half
Now,
ago? Can we
that
talk
was
about
when
that a little bit? What
sure,
happened with that? Because you did make a video talking about how, that was restricted through the pharmacy board.
yes. In late March, the governor of Minnesota issued an executive order that basically I thought represented an end run. It didn't tell physicians we couldn't prescribe it. It told pharmacies through the pharmacy board that they couldn't dispense it.
Right.
So I had physicians reach out to me, and for the first time in their career, they'd been writing prescriptions for a patient. Patient would go to pharmacy, and pharmacy would say, "We're not giving it to you."
Right.
That's a paradigm shift.
Right, because that's commonly used for lupus treatment, is it not?
Yes, hydroxychloroquine, its trade name is Plaquenil, and it's used for rheumatoid arthritis, a variety of erosive inflammatory arthritis, lupus, malaria prevention.
Mhm.
In some situations, depending upon the protozoan organism that's specifically causing the malaria, we'll use it for prevention or treatment.
Right. And so some patients were finding it difficult. I know I had some friends that actually she couldn't get her prescription filled. She'd been on this drug for 30 years.
My wife was on it for 15 years, and we went off of it a few years ago because her arthritis had stabilized. But yes, you're absolutely right. All of a sudden, people that were, if you will, hydroxychloroquine patients because of inflammatory arthritis, they were all of a sudden being told, you can't have 90 days. We'll give you 30 days, but we're not sure we're going to fill it next month.
Right.
And this is crazy.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it really gets you thinking about what is going on here, right? When
You
things
know,
like
when politics intersects with medicine, I don't necessarily expect good things.
yeah, no kidding. I want to talk to you about the fact that you are talking about vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, magnesium, quinine. These are things you've mentioned quite frequently. And that's not something we're hearing either. We're just really not hearing about being proactive and what you can do to, improve your outcomes, right? Why are you mentioning those things? And what kind of impact do you think that they will have or could
I
have?
suppose it, I suppose at some level it comes back to my basic nature of being somewhat of a skeptic and asking questions. I think before I went into medicine, I was in the seminary, and before that, I was in dental school. And I took a fair amount of history of medicine classes. And one of probably my favorite biblical character is the physician Luke.
Mm,
And I've read books about Luke, and I've read books about how did they practice medicine 2,000 years ago.
yeah.
I think we've gotten a little arrogant with Western medicine, and I think
Mhm.
it's unfortunate. If you look at many of the Southeastern Asian medical practices, they've been way ahead of the curve. I've had the good
Yes.
fortune of taking care of many patients from Japan, China, and Korea
Hmm.
whose ancestors had been in Southeast Asia. And so some of their traditions have been passed down.
Yeah.
Some of their thoughts have been passed down. And
Yeah.
my patients they're always educating me too. And
Right.
I think that the fact that digitalis comes from a foxglove plant or aspirin comes from the bark of a willow tree,
Right.
when you look at these kinds of natural sources of medications, you start to say, that's interesting. So for me, the world of herbs and supplements, I understand why it's not as well studied because there's not big dollars in
That's
it. And
right.
pharma drives the train.
That's
But
right.
that doesn't mean that these things aren't extremely useful. I
Right.
remember one year I wasn't having a particularly good year from a GI perspective. And a patient mentioned that they had been using turmeric.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I said, what
Amazing.
have I got to lose? So I went on it for 6 months. And I'll tell you, I had such a good result. And I was so appreciative. So I ask a lot of my patients what they're taking and why they're taking and what they're hoping for from it and things
Right.
like that.
Right.
And I also think that it's worthwhile for us to maybe reveal where did this schism between, if you will, patients and physicians start. And I think if there's probably three players. There's big pharma,
Hmm.
there's physicians, and there's patients. And I remember very vividly the 1990s when we started to see a real onslaught of direct to consumer marketing. And the
Yes.
reason some of that was necessary was because physicians make value judgments. We decide what drugs we think are appropriate for our patients to utilize.
Hmm.
And in those days when Big Pharma was coming out with products like Rogaine for
Right.
hair replacement or Viagra for
Right.
erectile dysfunction, these were, if you will, medical problems that physicians might have just not worthy of an office visit. And so
Right.
oftentimes physicians weren't sharing the availability of these products with their patients.
Oh,
To their
interesting.
patients, hair loss and erectile dysfunction may have been way more important than a mildly elevated cholesterol.
Right.
And so the pharmaceuticals said, we need to have the right to go directly to the consumer and let them know that we could help. And I remember, I think Bob Dole, Vice President Bob Dole, on TV, making some very appropriate, if you will, serious and sincere remarks about his life of intimacy with his wife had changed because he had aged.
Hmm.
And he was glad to say that he no longer had to consider that a chapter that's bygone because a medicine like Viagra could be
Helped
helpful.
him.
And it was
Right.
very well done. And that literally, the dam broke open. All of a
Right.
sudden, patients were coming in asking us about Viagra. And then we could no longer avoid the fact that patients wanted to talk about that possibility.
Right. Well, that's an interesting way to look at it. And that brings new light to me personally, because my view is kind of like, well, this whole pharma train got started back in the early 1900s. And to me, I have a hard time understanding in when they started, being able to patent drugs and make money off it, how it shifted so much from what currently existed at that time to this more petrochemical pharmaceutical model. And to me, it feels like, why would you throw away all these tools, right? As a physician, don't you want a huge toolbox of things that you could help people with? Because we know we're all so individual, right? When it comes to our health, one thing may work for one patient, it does nothing for another patient, right? One person is harmed by, just like having an allergy. Somebody is harmed by peanuts while somebody over here can eat a whole bag and love them. And so we're very individual. So why would we want to close off this 5,000-year study of homeopathy, acupuncture, Ayurvedic medicine, food, nutrition? Why is all that so closed off with this label of alternative, which I feel, if you read the history behind that, you can easily see that it was invented to make that current model at the time a secondary source of treatment.
Well, I think that looking back at the history and asking the question, how did we evolve into the profession of medicine we're at today. I think if we go back 150 years or less, we can see that the world of medicine, doctoring, wasn't very well established in regards to medical schools, the curriculum of a medical school.
Hmm.
And a lot of times you had people traveling salesmen slash doctors
Right.
who were selling snake oils or this or that or the other thing. And the two things that really elevated the world of medicine in the most obvious manner were medications
Hmm.
and surgeries that could be done without killing the patient.
Right.
When we started to understand the world of aseptic environments so that we could do surgery and not have our patients die of sepsis or blood poisoning, and when we had medicines such as antibiotics and prednisone and aspirin and insulin, and we actually had a repertoire of medicines that would help.
Right.
This changed the world. So if you look at it from that perspective, the thing that elevated our profession was surgery and drugs.
Right.
And the world of touching the patient, physical therapy, herbs, supplements, even education
Hmm.
were minimized.
Right.
Physical therapy and occupational therapy have a tremendous amount to offer. But for
Hmm.
a long time, they were sort of poo-pooed.
Yes.
And doctors said, why would I use physical therapy when I can have a pill prescribed?
Right.
Or
Right.
I can maybe get my scalpel out and fix this.
Right.
So I think that what goes around comes around. And I'd like to think that we're getting to a better place, that
Hmm.
Western medicine is becoming, once again, a forum where patients get to be their own best champion. They get to raise topics that they want to discuss.
Hmm.
And we as physicians don't feel like we have to be the big boss, the emperor of their health. We get to be a resource. We
Right.
get to be the Marcus Welby that walks alongside of a patient and says, "You raise an interesting point. Let's
Right.
talk about that."
Right. Right. If we're thinking in terms of, healing or curing, I think there needs to be a bit of a paradigm shift in us as patients where we're not looking to mask symptoms, right? But we're looking for real solutions because when we mask symptoms, well, another one's going to pop up because you never really fixed the problem. And so it's this integration, I hope, that we can come to. And maybe this is a good turning point. This whole ordeal. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to gain new understanding and kind of change the paradigm of how we look at our health. That this is a relationship. That we shouldn't just be dictated orders to it and just to say, okay, that's what I need to do. That we actually have to become critical thinkers and we have to look at resolving issues instead of covering them up, and maybe using allopathic methods like surgery or prescription drugs as crisis prevention, right? So we have this integrated model to use these things in crisis situations, but not as 20-year long remedies that don't really remedy anything. They just cover up the symptoms.
Well, I think you threw a pretty broad net out there. I would say that we have many pharmaceuticals that aren't designed for crisis management. I mean, I think if we're going to be saying that a person shouldn't have a blood pressure of 200 over 100, we don't want to wait till they have the heart attack. We want to lower that blood pressure down beforehand. And if we can do that through weight loss, improve nutrition, things like that, terrific. But many people have refractory blood pressure issues. And in that situation, I would certainly want to be able to use some of the prescription drugs I have available to not wait till a
Right.
crisis occurs. But
Right.
I do think that the key word that you've highlighted is integrated. And I
Yes.
think you're right. We need to integrate these modalities. And if all we do is just get out our prescription pad and don't talk about the weight loss, the smoking cessation, the reduction of alcohol, and
Right.
this kind of thing, we're not really fulfilling our contract with the patient. But I
Right.
think we need to remember perhaps two things. One will be critical of physicians and one will not be. The one that would be critical would be physicians do have the tendency to potentially inadvertently paralyze their patients into thinking that they can't manage their own healthcare matters.
Yes.
Physicians might use big words or remind a patient that there's no way that they would be able to choose which chemotherapy regimen would be best for their breast cancer.
Right.
I think that's abusive at some level. I think that if a physician says, listen, there may be some pieces here that you feel are beyond your ability to decide, and I'm here to help.
Right.
But we have some basic decisions that you can really do to drive the show.
Right.
So from that perspective, I think physicians are part of the problem. Now let's flip it and let's look at it from a physician's perspective.
Yeah.
Physicians are in a unique situation where we have a tremendous amount of education, and we need to be able to impart that to patients.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes patients aren't seemingly interested in having the information imparted that we have to give.
Right.
Specifically, you said patients want solutions. Well, physicians do too, but
Right.
sometimes we don't have them.
Yeah.
Sometimes all we have is partial solutions. If I had a dime for every time I told a patient, no, I'm not going to be able to help you with your fatigue. You're old, you're fat, and you're not taking care of yourself. So I'm sorry, you can't live that way for 80 years and then ask me during this 10-minute visit to fix your problem.
Right.
I'll work with you, but that's not fair. And in the same way we have some of those kinds of conversations being difficult and challenging, we also have unfortunately insulated ourselves from death. When I tell a patient that, you know what, you're not a heart transplant candidate.
Right.
Your heart is wearing out. Your ejection fraction represents that you're pumping 20% of what you should be. The fact of the matter is, you don't have much more than 2 years to live. If that kind of honest discussion causes a patient to say, well, by George, I'm going to go find a doctor who knows what he's talking about, that makes it more difficult for me to have those kinds of conversations.
Right.
So back to your point, this is a chance, an opportunity for us to pivot, to start having more honest discussions. Let's talk a little bit more about death and advance directives and living wills and consequences. But let's also talk about integrating naturopathic medicine with conventional Western medicine and do all the things. And let's remind all of us that America represents 4% of the world's population, and yet we take more than 50% of the prescription drugs.
Yes.
We take over 90% of the OxyContin made in this world. Americans consume it. We consume more than 80% of the narcotics. America has been gluttonous in regards to its appetite for pills.
Absolutely. I don't think, and I think the other piece of that is that sometimes we're not feeling good. And it's okay.
It's okay.
Right? It's part of life. And if you're going through a divorce, you're going to be sad. And you're going to have to go through that. It doesn't mean you should be able to go to the doctor and get a prescription for an antidepressant that then you become reliant on for the next 20 years. Because you were doing exactly what you should have been doing at that time, which is being sad and moving through that.
I think that's well said.
It's just become so easy to reach for something outside ourselves to make ourselves feel good instead of doing the inner work.
And there's a topic that we haven't even broached, and I doubt that we have time today, but then there's the whole issue of how do you keep this dollar-eating healthcare industry alive without high-buck procedures and high-buck pills and all that. And when you start to look at all the appetites that need to be fed, you run into a huge problem. And from my perspective, I say to my patients, this is not an easy time to be a patient. It might be a wonderful time because of all these, if you will, potential treatments that are available. But it's a very difficult time for a patient to sort out, do I really need to have this procedure?
Yeah.
In order for me to get this medicine or this intervention, do I really have to go through this procedure, which I really don't want to do? Do I get to have a choice about vaccines? Can I choose this, and this and follow more of a European model? Or is it all or nothing? And do I have to go along with this physician's list of all these vaccinations at this time, at this place now?
Right.
I mean, these are the honest, heart to heart kinds of discussions that can
Yes.
take place if there's a decent, trusting relationship. I always tell the patients, I say, if I can get you to trust me, it'll work better. But
Right.
the only way I get you to trust me is if I get you to know that I'm going to advocate for you.
Right.
So if patients feel that I'm their advocate,
Hmm.
then they're willing to extend to me some trust. And
Right.
when that kind of dynamic starts, that's when the magic happens.
Yep.
That's when we get good stuff.
Right. And I would add to that just about, the fact that you're advocating to them for them is wonderful. And I think that's what everybody should look for in a care provider is an advocate. But when we have insurance companies that are tying our hands as payers, I mean, my family pays over $1,200 a month for health insurance. It covers nothing. Nothing. We have a $10,000 deductible. I am not free to choose how I want to be treated. And that's an issue for me. And that should be an issue for everybody. That should really bother you that you can't choose how you want to be treated.
I agree with you. I've gotten myself in hot water at times because I have tremendous concerns about the fact that if a person is going to have an acute appendicitis or a heart attack or a stroke or a cancer diagnosis, and they have no way to receive that life-saving health care without getting a second mortgage on their house
Right.
or declaring bankruptcy, then we as a country have not done what we need to do. We have got to solve this problem.
Yeah.
And this problem is a lot bigger than having some of the ancillary elective medications and procedures done that we seem to do every day.
Right. So, my final question to you, I want to be very respectful of your time. I hope I'm not running over too late here. Is I think all of us want to know, particularly moms, how do we walk this back? This kind of intertwined political and medical collision that we're experiencing, where we just feel like there's a stronghold on our healthcare. How can we walk this back as just regular old folks out here?
I'm going to paraphrase Edmund Burke. He said something like this: all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And he also said that one of the worst things we can do is to do nothing because we could only do a little. We need to engage. We need to stand up for our rights. We need to recognize that if someone else's rights are being infringed and it's not bothering us, that's not enough of a reason to be passive, because if we don't stand up for them at some point in time, that same kind of depressing weight on our lives and our choices will happen to us.
Yes.
And there may be no one to come to our support.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy walk back. This
Right.
isn't an easy time,
No.
but
Sure.
we cannot let go of it. Our First Amendment rights for free speech,
Yep.
the ability to speak to a narrative that maybe is somewhat contrarian, and then to simply be accused of being some sort of knucklehead or some sort of conspiracy theorist,
Right.
that is an insult.
Yes.
So I would tell everybody, we need you to engage. We need you to don't necessarily accept what you see. Fact check things. I mean, I've learned to do that. If something seems too bizarre to believe, then fact check it. Go, there's different sources. Do some research. Do some homework. Don't take the shortcuts. We
Right.
need to do that. Know who you're listening to. If Fox News is considered that they lean right and CNN is considered that they lean left, then see if there's someone that you can find that's in the middle.
That's right.
We need to take responsibility for ourselves. And I know that I've fallen short on this. I know that 7, 8 months ago, I perhaps was more naive than I should have allowed myself to be.
Right.
I'm far more rigorous in terms of checking out sources than I used to be.
Yep.
And yeah, we all need to do that. And I think we're up to it. I really do. I have a lot of faith in Americans. And I think, frankly, we'll have a lot more common sense coming to the table if we ignore a little bit the bureaucrats, the politicians, the academics, the physicians, the scientists, and the political epidemiologists.
Right.
Let's lean into America.
Yeah.
Americans,
get out in your community. Look around.
absolutely.
Look
You
around.
can do it, America.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on today and talking this conversation. I learned so much. You opened my eyes to a few points, and I know you've provided a lot of information for people out there. And just please continue doing your videos, and please keep talking to us.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. And if I could just say one thing, in the book of Esther in the Old Testament, chapter 4, verse 14, the question is asked for all of us. Have you thought that you're in the position you're in for such a time as this? Let's think about that.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Senator, and you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. If the naturally inspired movement makes sense to you, let's do this together and transform the medical model and help people take charge of their health. Learn more about how you can join the Naturally Inspired movement by going to naturallyinspiredadvocate.com or call me at 970-475-4862.